freedom. So I can only imagine that after the incredible journey that Tarek has taken all of us on, so deeply personal, understanding what this means in the lives of one person at a time, but also understanding the bigger context, the immense medical challenges playing out, and the overarching cruelty of everything in Gaza. And I can only imagine that your hearts are pounding and your minds are swirling with questions and comments. So we want to give you an opportunity to ask those questions or to share some reflections coming out of what you've heard tonight. We have, there's 2 microphones at the front of each aisle, and I think we have our first questioner.
Thank you both so much. Quick comment for anyone who's interested in the new documentary by Abby Martin called Gaza Fights for Freedom, and it was in collaboration with a lot of groups within Gaza using high-quality Steadicam cameras, and it's really amazing to see the footage within the documentary, so that's on the internet. And in that documentary, this is leading to my question, in that documentary it mentions how a lot of the activist groups within Gaza and Palestine are calling for BDS, in terms of international action to put a stop to this. And I'm just curious why Amnesty International supports a weapons embargo but stops short of a BDS. Thank you.
So as you know, Amnesty does have a very active campaign underway calling for boycotts with respect to goods that are produced in the illegal settlements, and is very actively campaigning on that as many ways as we can right around the world. That's our area of focus right now. With respect to wider BDS issues, we have not taken up the campaign. We certainly aren't opposed to it. I wouldn't want anyone to imagine that the fact that we're not doing active campaigning in that way suggests opposition. Not at all. We've chosen a very strategic focus for our work, and have marshaled a lot of activism and really interesting campaigning and even legal challenges in countries around the world with that focus. And then at the same time, certainly do actively intervene the various ways in which a number of governments seek to penalize and punish BDS activism, outlaw it, make it illegal, etc. We obviously do take that up very strongly. It's fundamentally a crucial freedom of expression concern. And sometimes there's a bit of a strategic consideration here. Sometimes the fact that we're not part of, and this plays out in other human rights issues as well, where we're sometimes not part of the issue itself, actually gives us more strength and credibility to be the outside monitor, such that when BDS activists are targeted from that sort of objective, neutral amnesty place, we're able to speak out and strongly criticize it. So that factors into it as well. Does this mean that our campaigning in this space won't continue to evolve and change over time? Of course it may, and we'll continue to make those assessments moving forward. Over here.
Hi there. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much. My voice is a little shaky because I'm quite moved. Both of you, I really appreciate your work. I have 2 extremely short practical questions. One is, I was just amazed by the technical medical work that you're doing, and wonder, I do some work in other countries, I'm sure other people do as well. How can other people access that technology and have it be shared? And then my other question, also very practical, I didn't bring any cash. How can I contribute?
See me, I'll be glad to talk.
And everyone's.
I'm happy to talk to anybody, checks.
Okay, so in terms of the technology, basically there are other organizations who have made really great technology that we can't use. For example, there's this really wonderful pulse oximeter called the LifeBox, And it was designed for exactly the scenario that exists in Gaza. But we can't use it because it's not open source, and we can't modify it to our needs, and we can't really take it and manufacture it on site there, or test it or modify it or anything like that. So we make all of our work accessible in two ways. The easy way is all of our work is open source. You can go on to GitHub. So for those of you who are computer geeks, GitHub is one of the places where people collect their computer geekery and share it with other fellow geeks. Anyway, so we're on GitHub, and you can download all of our stuff. But the fact is that if you were just to share a recipe with somebody, that is of some value but not full value. So we've made ourselves also available as the Glia project to anybody who wants to, so that we can do what we call knowledge translation. We can help people recreate it. Right now, we have active projects in Canada, so there's Glia Canada, in Gaza, Glia Gaza, and in Tunisia, Glia Tunisia. But there's work we're talking to groups in Mexico. It won't surprise those of you who know Mexico much, that it's with a group that's affiliated with the Zapatistas down there, who are very much about self-reliance and love the idea of being able to take and integrate whatever they want of the technology. We are really keen on the technology being top-notch, so we won't help people do things that we think will degrade the quality. We don't want to give garbage to people in the third world, and we don't want to give good enough medical equipment to people in the third world. So when we talk to people, we assess very much what they want, make sure that our ideologies are aligned. Anyone can use the tech, but in terms of us spending our time, we spend it on the projects we think will provide excellent care to other people.
I think I'm going to use the word geekery at least 10 times tomorrow. I like that. And Peter, I'm going to suggest, I don't know if you or others around you have any bright ideas as to whether we could use something like e-transfers to facilitate some giving for people. Just plant that out there. There's nothing like in the moment. You know, once they're gone, the chances that those checks come back, I think, diminish like 50% each day. So I don't know, e-transfers might be one option. Pull up your smartphones. Yes, next question.
Well, first of all, thank you both for being here tonight. And I saw the baskets going around, lots of generous people this evening, so thank you for that as well. A couple of questions. Tarek, when you were being treated, I didn't catch if you got fully treated there, or I think you went to the hospital. And I'm just wondering, as an emergency room doctor, how the treatment was. Like, are they very advanced there, especially with shootings, or were you like, no, don't do that, do this? That's one question. And then second one, like about the stethoscopes and products that you're making, has anybody ever approached you to like copy it for other countries, or get involved in that way? And do you have any worry, like as soon as you said that the pipe was made from Coke, the things, I was like, if Israel catches on, do you fear they'll do something to cut off this supply to you somehow? I know you get it in Gaza, but puncture holes or make Coke take it back, something,
Okay, I'll take the second question first because it's easy. When you put Coca-Cola behind you, it's really, you don't get too worried about them trying to mess with Coke. There's actually a Coca-Cola factory in Gaza, very close to the border. And to build it, they needed more concrete than all of Gaza received in almost a year. Okay? Just for one Coca-Cola factory. And by the way, that factory, if it were ever to get to full speed, would use more water than all of Gaza has available to it. So clearly, Coca-Cola is future thinking. And actually, really interesting, I remember thinking about this and then thinking, they must know that they would get bombed unless they're careful. And if you look on Google Images, I've actually gone through and looked, and you can see a big Coca-Cola in the satellite images. So they've painted big Coca-Cola on top of it. Now, it's the only place really in Gaza that has a big logo painted on top. Why? Because they know no Israeli soldier is going to look at a Coca-Cola logo on a roof and bomb that thing. Okay? So I think when we pick these things, we pick them because they're ubiquitous, because they're very, very hard to stop, and because we have other somewhat unexpected allies. Like if they try to stop Coca-Cola tubing from coming in, Israel is not going to be dealing with us. We're going to be dealing with Coca-Cola.
Not just stop it from getting in, but you get it after it's used? Or
No,
from the factory?
no, but I mean, you're not gonna, like, the Coca-Cola tubing, to try to control that like a weapon would be very, very hard. It'd be incredibly hard, because every restaurant has fountain pop in there. And so you could walk into any restaurant, or any, obviously restaurants are fed by these suppliers, go to any supplier, they're not gonna ask you for some, you know, like, we'll open a falafel stand if we need to, so that we can get the Coca-Cola tubing. It's not going to be a big deal. It's like one of the smaller problems we'd have dealt with. As for the shooting, so when a person gets shot, we divide it into what's called low velocity and high velocity. This is very different from the high velocity word that you used, that you heard used by Alex here. In medicine, high velocity is very, very high velocity. And low velocity is basically all the guns that we see used in Gaza that are mounted to people, with the exception of some sniper rifles. So with a low velocity, there's a big risk of infection, and you have to operate on all of these wounds because they get infected. Of course, with 1,700 people shot in one day, what ended up happening is that I was taken to the hospital, not rushed, that's the wrong word. I sat around waiting for 5 other people of about the same severity as me to get shot before we were stacked into an ambulance, 6 people in an ambulance. If any of you have ever been in an ambulance, you understand what that means. And then taken to the emergency. Oh, and by the way, while we were waiting, I was offered pain control Advil, which is a great drug, but once I got there, the doctors were so overwhelmed that actually the doctor who came to treat me was one of my residents, a doctor who I had trained, which you imagine might be a good thing unless you knew how bad of a teacher I was. So I was like, no, I got this. Actually, I mean, it was I kid, he's a wonderful doctor, but he was busy. Literally, a few minutes after I came in, a man came in who was shot in the neck, and so he was busy with him, and I just sewed myself up. Which, I did not kiss that boo-boo, because that increases infection risk. Which is a mistake. You're not supposed to sew up gunshot wounds, but what I was doing was I was making a bargain that it was worse to not sew it up than to sew it up. I cleaned it as well as I could, and I closed it up, because I didn't know what was going to happen next. And actually, I thought there might be a war, and that I'd have to be back on my feet treating patients, even if on a crutch. I ended up getting a kind of infection called sepsis. That means that the infection spreads from that spot to the blood. And if it gets bad enough, then it can do what it did to me, a thing called ARDS. My lungs started to fill with blood. And so I sat there, I actually had a prototype pulse oximeter, and I just put this pulse oximeter on my finger, and I was like, I hope it's not terrible. And I just watched my oxygen basically drop until it got to a point where, I didn't know what was going to happen. I told very few people about that problem at the time, a couple of friends. My chief in London, the doctor chief, and I told him I was just going to watch him and see. And I took oral antibiotics, which is crazy. You get IV antibiotics in any hospital in the world. And I just waited. And luckily I was so healthy going in. The biggest determinant of your outcome is what you put in. That I was able to survive that. But you know that dozens of other people didn't. Yes, next question.
I have 2 questions. First of all, I really thank you for this event, and thank you for Tarek. The first question is, as Tarek has mentioned, for the diagrams, for the education is something very low. Did the OFIP have any cooperate between Canada as they exchange the students between Gaza and Canada, as they do exchange students between Canada and other countries? And did the OFIB have any contribution between government of Canada to get training more doctors from hospitals in Gaza as they need it? And they need more training to exchange them here, to give them more training and more experience, as what they did with other countries? That's the second question. And the third question is, for the equipment and medication supplies, did any easier way to support Gaza with the equipment and materials, or is it blocked gate there? Thank you.
And sorry, what is OFIP?
The organization.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. And, all right, got it. In that case, maybe somebody from OFIP can comment on the exchange program. Is there anybody where you can? Do you want to do that, Peter?
All I can say is we're not involved with the exchange program. That's not ours is a Canadian organization. This is dealing with Canadian education.
What exchange program are you referring to?
Exchanging programs as they do in the universities, between the exchange students between other countries and Canada to get more higher studies, a master's and PhD between Gaza students to here, to give them more training and give them higher degree as a master and PhD as what he does Canadian universities with other countries. That's number one. And the doctors to get more training.
The doctors.
Yes, that's the most important, because the hospitals there, they are suffering from the less experience to help people there, and we saw a lot of tragedy there with the losing their lives because they are less experienced, doesn't have enough experience to help people there in the hospitals.
Okay, so in terms of the master's and the PhD, I don't think any of us can competently comment on that at the moment. In terms of physicians, we have a project called Keys of Health, in which we train Gazan doctors and West Bank doctors, it's a project for both, in Canada for subspecialty. Gaza and the West Bank both have excellent residency training. They actually train doctors very well. That's not the main problem. It's the subspecialty training that's really problematic for it. And of course, even after we do that, the next problem will be, okay, so now you've trained all of these doctors, you can't send a doctor into the void. You have to provide them with other things, and that's where GLIA is coming in. When I went in to Gaza, first all I was doing was training. And then I would train my doctors, and they would say to me, well, great, doctor, but what are we supposed to do with this information you've told us? We have none of the equipment. So it really is a multifaceted problem, and Keys of Health deals with part of that. Of course, you can donate to them. The main agency sponsoring them in Canada is called Islamic Relief Canada. GLIA is the medical devices project that I'm working on, and the main sponsoring agency in Canada is London Health Sciences Foundation. And then there's Empower Gaza, which right now is figuring out the next plan, and that was a solar power project for hospitals that has more or less finished the hospitals in Gaza now, and is moving on to the clinics in Gaza, so we're preparing all the clinics that we're going to outfit in Gaza. So I think it's a multi-pronged attack. The training of doctors, we're trying to be as creative as possible. It's definitely happening. We know it needs to happen. Lots of doctors in Gaza have problems, but the problems aren't necessarily what you imagine. You can't just bring them out and train them. In Canada, many doctors become incompetent over time. I can tell I'm now 10 years into practice, and I can feel myself getting less and less capable over time. And the only way that I can go back up to an acceptable level of competence is through what we call continuing medical education. And that's one of the big things missing in Gaza. Every doctor starts competent, for the most part. It's that over time they degrade.
For the materials, UNRWA doesn't help with that to supply, to give supplies and to support that supply for that, or no?
No, UNRWA is not involved in medical devices at all. You're maybe thinking of World Health Organization.
Yes.
They're involved with that.
Next question.
Hi, thank you both for speaking. It was really amazing to hear your experiences and also the information that you shared. So I believe that I first saw you speak on Democracy Now!, which is an alternative news source, and I'm wondering, as someone who's been on the ground, can considering all the coverage on social media and corporate media and independent news, how do you think that corporate media, which is the most accessible to many people, has been covering the events, and do you feel that it is representative of what's actually happening?
Yeah, I think they're doing a great job. Okay, so I think it's pretty obvious that the corporate media is not representing the issues very well, and that's for a number of reasons. If I may redirect the question a little bit to how much should we care about what the corporate media is doing? And I think that the answer there is that we shouldn't care all that much. So if basically when we do something, we have to pick a target audience. And if the target audience that we pick is the corporate media, then what we'll do is we'll find ourselves very much chasing something that is both ephemeral and, in my opinion, relatively useless. Because really the only thing that you get when you get the corporate media is fame, which is meaningless in this context. Instead, what I've found is that by picking the right audience, and working to change things for them. So in my case, it would be the Palestinian patient or the Canadian patient, because GLIA, actually, the biggest irony is even though we really want GLIA to be working in Gaza, it's probably distributed way more devices in Canada because the barriers are lower. We've helped more Canadian patients than we've helped Gaza patients. So when you target the correct patient community, then what you find is that the corporate media shows up, because fundamentally they come where there's something to talk about. And so that's been the approach that I've taken, more or less disregarding them. Yes, you do have to balance it. You do have to cooperate or talk to them about it. But I think if you're watching Democracy Now!, then I'm guessing that you've thought about these issues. We can't be dragged by them. When they want to talk about issues that aren't our issues, I just refuse to play. Right? So I think that that's the real key, is maintaining our own integrity. And of course, the other piece, like I only did one interview after I got shot, one television interview. I also did a CBC interview. And that one television interview was Democracy Now! Why didn't I do it anywhere else? It's because we also have to create our own alternatives. And like you, I watch Democracy Now! Every day, and I think that if we don't foster, create, fund, donate to our own alternatives, then how can we expect them to do what it is that we want? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Dr. Loubani, thank you very much for your talk. You talk beautifully and bring us humanity and kindness. My question is really about what Alex is saying here about, and I agree we should absolutely have an arms embargo, but are we aiming too low? You mentioned the UN. We have in the UN a Security Council on which is seated as a permanent member one of the most prolific human rights abusers in the globe today. And in a way, the issues of Israel and Palestine are not that dissimilar from the issues in China. And should we not join them somehow, at least from a moral point of view? And shouldn't we be demanding that the UN actually stand for something that it pretended, that it started out to stand for when it was founded, and it's been corrupted? Shouldn't we aim a bit higher? We had a human rights and foreign policy evening in St. John's about 2 years ago. Unfortunately, Amnesty didn't participate at that time. But that's what we're trying to get at. It's the same as Peter is saying. We want a Canadian policy that's founded, foreign policy should be founded on human rights. That should be the bottom line. We shouldn't be too distracted by trade. We should be willing to take hardship. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that. I can't imagine there's a single person here who wouldn't agree with you. I certainly heartily agree with you. on both levels, on the level of the United Nations, and I can assure you that Amnesty and I'm sure many organizations that people here are involved with are very engaged in those efforts, whether it's pushing for human rights-based reforms at the United Nations, being the watchdogs who speak out and criticize the far too frequent decisions that the UN, China not being the only culprit, is responsible for that completely disregards human rights. So absolutely that entire vast terrain of UN reform, pushing for reform that puts human rights first and gets rid of some of the early vestiges of the UN's founding, the veto power, etc., that stands in the way of decision-making that is of integrity and based on human rights. And then at the Canadian level, couldn't echo you more. The need for foreign policy, absolutely with respect to Israel OPT, absolutely with respect to China, but every corner of the world that puts human rights first when it's inconvenient, when it's costly, when it comes up against powerful competing interests. I think all of us need to be that voice with our own local MPs, building allies to constantly bring that message forward. So thanks for reminding us of that. I'm not sure who was first. Yeah? Okay.
Hi, Alex.
Hello.
Tarek, we've been introduced online, so it's nice to see you live. Just following on the last couple of comments, and actually referring back to your comments, Alex. Just for the people in the room, my name is Fareed Khan. I've been involved with Rohingya advocacy on the Rohingya genocide. And one of the things that we've seen in what's happening with the Rohingya is it parallels what's happening to Palestinians. However, what's happened to the Rohingya has been called genocide. Alex, I know that Amnesty does not use that term with respect to what's happening with Palestinians, but if anybody wants to look up the UN Genocide Convention, there's 5 criteria which constitute genocide. And what Israel is doing meets 3 of those criteria. And what's prosecutable under the Genocide Convention, one of the prosecutable criteria is advocating genocide. And Israeli politicians advocated genocide of Palestinians. Also prosecutable is complicity. Canada, by the actions that it's taken under liberal governments, under conservative governments with respect to the Palestinians, is complicity. And so Canada is complicit in genocide. We are now in a situation politically in Canada where we have a minority government. My work that I've done, not just in recent years, but going back many years, the one thing that I believe, and I consistently believe and I think works, is that you have to push, you have to push, you have to push, you have to get in the face of the politicians. Even to the point of getting angry at them publicly. The Palestinian, it's not a conflict, it's basically a massacre. It's been going on for more than half a century. Being done by a people who themselves fled genocide. It's a perversity that just is unfathomable. If there's one thing that you can tell the people here in this room to go back and do, I know what I would say, but I want to hear from each of you in terms of the political action that can be taken. What is it, like 3 things that can be done? 3 things that you can tell people in this room what they need to do with respect to our politicians, because we can't affect, as individuals, affect the UN. We can affect our government here in Canada. And it enrages me, it incenses me when I see politicians stand up on Victims of Genocide Day, on Holocaust Remembrance Day, on Human Rights Day, on Anti-Racism Day, and talk about these historical atrocities that have been committed, and talk about never again, when it is happening again and again and again. It's happening in Palestine, it's happening in Myanmar, it's happening in China, it's happening in Kashmir, and other places. And I have gone on CBC, CTV, the various media, and basically said to the camera, I'm sorry, you're a bunch of liars. Maybe not in so many words, but basically to that effect. Because you don't care about human rights. I look at that banner, thoughtful, respectful, principled. Well, that is not our government. in terms of the way it deals with human rights issues. And I was very happy to see your column, Alex, earlier when that got published. I think it was in the Globe and Mail, where you talked about, human rights should be the foundation of foreign policy. I totally agree with you. But we need to do something more than what we do in these small groups when we gather together. We need to do something that gets us out into the offices, into the streets, because otherwise, what's happening right now, it's been happening for 50 years, is going to continue to happen. Thanks.
Thank you, Fareed, impassioned as always. I guess I would just repeat some of the calls that I highlighted in my own opening comments as certainly some of the key things that we hope you and others will continue to mobilize around. The call, and this is also about pressing our own government to champion these calls, about pushing for the lifting of the blockade, being an outspoken voice when protesters and medics and doctors are targeted in the ways we've learned tonight, pushing for an arms embargo, championing international justice, really getting behind the idea of an international criminal court investigation, for instance. And I think the other thing to throw in the mix, which hasn't, I guess, so much been emphasized in our amnesty materials tonight, but I think there are so many times when the most powerful act, and I think we see this so much in what Tarek is telling us from on the ground in Gaza, is about responding to an individual case, an individual prisoner, the call for justice for an individual who has been killed. We don't hear our government speaking out at that level as well. So those would be some of the things that I would highlight.
Yeah, I see Anita here, so I think my time is very nearly up as well. One thing that I'd like to say, thank you, Fareed, for your comments. One of the common traps that I know I sometimes fall into is thinking that the Palestinians are waiting for me to do something. And what I realized being in Gaza is that there's no Superman coming. There's no big tanker going to come and plow down the blockade and, empty into the streets a lot of products that are needed. And the Palestinians have very much taken it upon themselves to do what they need to gain their own liberation. The liberation of the South Africans, yes, was aided by solidarity from outside, but it was at the hands of the South Africans. And the liberation of the Palestinians, yes, might be aided by people on the outside, but it ain't going to go on for another 50 years. The Palestinians are very much on the cusp by their own doing of dismantling this occupation and the kind of colonialism of the Israeli state at the moment.
One last very short question.
Quick question. At the time that you were shot, Dr. Loubani, I remember the Prime Minister went and said, we're going to have an investigation and see how this happened. And I'm just wondering if anything ever came of that, if his office ever reached out to you?
Yes, so I had the chance to speak to Prime Minister Trudeau at the time. And what I said to him and what I said to Minister Freeland is that I consider it very politically expedient for you to ask for an investigation because we all know it's going nowhere. Because firstly, the Israelis are not going to allow it to be independent, which they haven't. When they came, I told them I would cooperate fully, and when they came, there were 3 people wearing military gear with